March 4th, 1945. The dawn over northern Germany looked nothing like the women expected when the lorry jolted over the last stretch of frozen road toward the gates of Stalag VB. The sky was a dull metallic grey, heavy and low, the kind that seemed to press breath from the lungs. Frost coated the barbed wire, turning each twisted strand into a line of tiny crystals. The place looked exactly like the word enemy camp was supposed to look: cold, hostile and unforgiving. And for the British women sitting shoulder to shoulder in the back of the truck, nurses, clerks, ATS drivers, medics and a few civilian volunteers caught behind collapsing lines. It was the culmination of every fear they had silently rehearsed for weeks. Private Evelyn Hart, 26 years old and normally composed enough to calm an entire field hospital, felt the tremor in her hands as she adjusted her scarf. She had been captured outside Aachen while escorting a convoy of wounded soldiers. She had survived artillery, air raids, and long marches. But this, being delivered into the hands of the enemy, felt like stepping through a doorway she would never return from. The other British women sat stiffly beside her, their eyes flicking between the German guards marching along the perimeter and the wooden huts visible through the coils of wire. Rumours had already shaped their expectations. They had heard stories, half-whispered among prisoners in transit camps, of brutality, starvation, and punishments designed to break morale. One woman, Alice Morton, a 21-year-old typist from Kent, had barely spoken since the convoy that captured them separated her from her fiancé, a sergeant in the infantry. She curled her fingers tightly around a small tin locket hidden inside her glove, the only thing she had smuggled through searches. For her and the others, this morning was not merely a change of location. It felt like the moment the war finally stripped them of everything familiar. The lorry halted. The gate clanked open. A cold silence enveloped them. German guards stood lined up, rifles slung casually, not raised. Their uniforms looked worn, the fabric thinned from years of shortages. One sergeant barked an order, but even his tone lacked the harshness the women had braced for. He gestured them down with a curt wave rather than a blow. Still, none of the women relaxed. They stepped onto the frozen mud with the caution of people expecting violence at any moment. An elderly German medic approached. His hands tucked inside wool gloves, a Red Cross band on his arm. His posture wasn't aggressive. If anything, he looked tired, as though he had seen too much of war to muster hostility. Through an interpreter, he instructed them to line up for processing, adding softly, "No fear. Camp follows Geneva." His English was fractured, but the message carried enough clarity to confuse them. Geneva. They exchanged glances. That wasn't what they had been told to expect. As they were led across the yard, Evelyn noticed strange details that contradicted her expectations. A group of German orderlies pushed a cart filled not with weapons or restraints, but with crates of potatoes and dark, coarse bread. A young German sentry, he couldn't have been older than 17, kept stealing nervous glances at the British women, as though he were the one unsure of what to expect from them. And near the far end of the compound, behind a line of fir trees, she could hear laughter. Not mocking, not cruel, but the simple, weary laughter common in all military camps everywhere. It unsettled her more than shouts would have. The British women were taken into a long wooden barracks where a stove glowed red in the centre. The warmth hit their frozen hands like a shock. Two German female auxiliaries, one in her 30s, the other barely out of girlhood, distributed blankets and directed them to benches. "Sit, please," the older one said in slow, careful English. "No standing required." Another contradiction. No barking, no pushing, no confiscation of blankets or coats. Evelyn felt the other British women shifting, stiffening with confusion. This was wrong, or rather, it failed to align with everything they had prepared themselves for. Processing took place in an adjoining room where a German clerk, thin from rationing but polite, recorded their names and service roles. There was no shouting, no threats. When Alice Morton hesitated before giving her home address, fearing it might be used against her, the clerk simply nodded and moved to the next question without irritation. Returned to the main barracks, the British women were told they would be assigned to their living quarters shortly, but for now they should warm themselves and wait. Evelyn sat near the stove, the heat teasing the feeling back into her fingertips. Around her, the women whispered their confusion. "This isn't right," one murmured. "It's a trick," another insisted. "They'll show their real face soon." But then the door swung open and a German guard entered, carrying a metal pot so large it required both hands. Behind him came another with stacks of dented ceramic bowls. The smell drifting from the pot froze the women in disbelief. Soup. Hot, steaming soup, thickened with barley. And, impossible as it seemed, chunks of turnip and cabbage floating inside. "Meal," the guard said simply. "You eat now." The women stared. They hesitated. They waited for the catch. Instead, the German guards stepped back and allowed the female auxiliaries to distribute the food. No one shouted at them to hurry. No one refused second ladles to those who reached their bowls out timidly. For the first time since capture, the British women felt warmth spread through their bodies, not just from the stove, but from the unexpected humanity of the moment. Evelyn watched Alice Morton lift her first spoonful. Tears welled in the young woman's eyes, not because of cruelty, but because she had braced herself for hunger, cold, and humiliation, and instead received the most ordinary yet profound comfort imaginable, a hot meal served without contempt. The German auxiliaries moved through the room offering slices of dark bread, apologizing in halting English that rations were limited. When one British woman dropped her bread slice from shaking fingers, a guard knelt, and retrieved it for her, dusting off the bit of ash it had picked up from the stove's edge. The room fell silent from shock. These were not the Germans they had imagined. Later, they were escorted to their assigned barracks, 2 long huts built sturdily, with straw-stuffed mattresses and thick wool blankets issued to each bunk. A potbelly stove stood in the centre, already burning. The German sergeant overseeing the placement explained through gestures that they would receive additional coal every 2 days. Evelyn ran her hand across the blanket. Coarse but clean. She suddenly remembered the stories of POWs sleeping on bare floors, of brutality and deprivation. None of this fit. As evening settled, the British women were allowed a supervised walk around the central yard. They observed the male German prisoners assigned to kitchen duty offering shy nods. They saw German guards sharing cigarettes with each other, leaning against walls the same way British soldiers did back home. The war, it seemed, had stripped away not only resources, but also the illusions of superiority or difference. At sunset, a German officer approached the barracks and addressed them in formal but gentle English. He explained camp rules, medical schedules, mail procedures, and work assignments. He reminded them that they were protected under the Geneva Convention and that the commandant insisted on strict adherence. He concluded with a phrase none of them expected. "You are enemies of Germany," he said, "but you are also women and soldiers and prisoners whose safety is our duty. You will be treated correctly here." The women exchanged astonished glances. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a performance. It was simply order, humanity, a strange pocket of civility inside a collapsing nation. That night, after lights out, Evelyn lay awake staring at the wooden rafters above her bunk. The stove's heat warmed the room, and the soft breathing of her companions created a rhythm that eased her tension. She replayed the day in her mind, the polite processing, the warm soup, the respectful guards. She thought about the way the German auxiliaries offered bread with downcast eyes, as though ashamed of the scarcity. She remembered the sergeant's quiet insistence on rules that protected them. Nothing about this resembled what she had prepared for. Her thoughts drifted to the German women they had seen inside the camp, the auxiliaries who had smiled shyly and asked, "More blanket?" The men who had saluted them with genuine military courtesy, the guards who seemed almost relieved to have prisoners who were not hostile, not resisting, not terrified. Slowly, something began to form inside her mind. Not trust, she wasn't naive. Not sympathy either, but an unsettling sense that the boundaries drawn by war were thinner than she once believed. The line between enemy and human had blurred the moment she tasted that soup. Across the room, she heard Alice whisper to no one in particular, "It's strange. I thought this place would be hell." A pause. A slow, disbelieving exhale. "But it feels safe." The wind outside rattled the barracks walls, but inside, a soft quiet settled, heavy, warm, and disorienting. Evelyn closed her eyes. She didn't know it yet, but in the days to come, the British women would make discoveries that defied every wartime narrative they had been raised on. They would see German guards lining up to give their extra bread to them. They would be invited to join in Christmas hymns in 2 languages. They would be allowed to walk freely across parts of the compound. They would witness German soldiers defending them from mistreatment by visiting SS units. They would be offered medical care that was sometimes better than what German civilians received. And one day, much sooner than any of them expected, they would begin referring to this place, this enemy camp, with a phrase whispered half in disbelief and half in gratitude. Paradise on earth. But that revelation still lay ahead. For now, Section 1 ends with the British women drifting into uneasy but warm sleep, unaware that their understanding of the enemy and of themselves was about to transform in ways no one could have predicted. The morning of their second day in Stalag Vyby began with a sound none of the women could quite believe at first, knocking on the barracks door, followed by the gentle scrape of ceramic against wood. When Evelyn sat up, pulling her blanket around her shoulders, she saw a German camp orderly, an older man with thinning hair and a limp, carefully placing 2 steaming kettles inside the doorway. He nodded once respectfully and said in slow English, "Hot water, wash. Coffee also. Little coffee." Then he added with unexpected politeness, "Guten Morgen." No guard, no barking, no threats, just a man bringing morning wash water as though they were guests rather than prisoners. The British women exchanged glances edged with confusion, suspicion, and something else, an uncertainty that bordered on disbelief. Evelyn stepped forward first, dipping her fingers into the hot water. Real heat, real comfort. After the endless freezing marches that preceded their arrival, the sensation felt almost luxurious. Alice Morton joined her a moment later, her eyes widening. "This isn't normal," she whispered. "It can't be." But normal had lost all meaning since entering this place. As they washed, the auxiliary from the previous day, the older one with steady hands and a tired face, walked the rows of bunks, pointing gently at boots, socks, and uniform sleeves. "Laundry," she explained. "You give, we clean. Tomorrow return, ja?" They stared. She added almost apologetically, "We have machine, for women, officers allowed." Then, as though afraid she had offended them, she added softly, "You are enemies, but women also, so machine allowed." The absurdity of the explanation made several of the British women blink. Laundry machines? For POWs? Evelyn handed over her socks slowly, half expecting a trick, half expecting the auxiliary to snatch them away and laugh. Instead, the woman nodded with gratitude, as though the British were doing her a kindness. And then came the second shock of the morning. The commandant himself requested their presence. Not all of them, just the senior-ranking British servicewomen, Evelyn, an ATS corporal named Margaret Fielding, and a civilian nurse with the Red Cross, Helen Parker. They were escorted, not marched, not pushed, across the compound by a guard who walked beside them rather than behind them, giving directions with polite gestures. The commandant's office was a small wooden building warmed by a coal stove. On his desk sat a small vase containing 3 winter flowers, barely alive but carefully arranged. He stood when the women entered, removing his cap. He was in his 50s, his face lined but not severe. His voice was formal but warm. "Ladies," he began in fluent English, "you are prisoners of war. I cannot change that. But you are also under my protection. My camp has rules. Those rules are for your safety. and for the honor of Germany. Honor. The word sounded almost archaic, but there was nothing mocking in his tone. He continued, "In this camp, the Geneva Convention is law. You will not be harmed. You will not be insulted. You will not be deprived of meals or medical care. You will work only within regulations. No guard may shout at you. If any man behaves improperly toward you, he will be punished. You have my word." The three British women stood in stunned silence. Then the commandant added something none of them expected. "My own daughter is 23, he said quietly. "She is a nurse in Berlin. I pray she is treated well if captured." "So I will treat you well also." It was not propaganda. It was not for display. The sincerity in his voice struck them with a force stronger than intimidation ever could. After the meeting, they were returned to their barracks, again escorted politely, where the other women awaited them with questions spilling from their lips. "What did he say? Are they going to move us? Do they want something from us?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, he just wants the rules followed." The whispers that spread afterward were confused, hopeful, and deeply unsettling. War had taught them to expect cruelty, not courtesy. Yet kindness, real, measured kindness, was harder to process than fear. By midday, the German guards arrived with their first work assignments. Again, the women tensed. Work in POW camps could mean anything. Hard labour, dangerous tasks, humiliation disguised as discipline. But the assignments were shockingly mild. Some were sent to peel potatoes in the kitchen under the supervision of a one-armed German cook who kept offering them extra slices when no officers were watching. Others were sent to fold linens in the infirmary. 2 were assigned to help stack firewood next to the barracks, work so light it felt almost insulting after everything they had braced themselves for. Evelyn and Margaret were assigned to the infirmary. Expecting filth and suffering, they instead entered a space that had clearly been kept with obsessive care. The floors were scrubbed. The beds were neatly arranged. German medics, overworked and short on supplies, moved with quiet efficiency. They greeted the British women with nods, not glares. Helen Parker, the nurse, immediately understood what she was seeing. "They're running this place on almost nothing," she murmured, "but they're doing it properly." As Evelyn helped to wash metal trays and fold bandages, a German medic named Franz, thin, spectacled, barely older than the British women, asked her in accented English, "You have proper medical training?" "A year's experience in field hospitals," she replied cautiously. His relief was visible. "Good. Then please, help with this," he said, leading her to a supply table where new bandages needed rolling. She stared. "You trust a prisoner?" He shrugged. "You are not SS. You are soldiers. War ends soon. Work helps us both." There was no ideology in him, no superiority, just exhaustion and the faint glimmer of decency. During their break, the German medics offered them thin mugs of ersatz coffee. Franz added an extra cube of sugar to Evelyn's mug without saying a word. Sugar was rare. Giving it to a prisoner was unthinkable under normal wartime conditions. Evelyn noticed the small gesture. It struck her harder than any speech could have. That afternoon, something even stranger happened. The guards permitted the British women to walk the perimeter path around the compound, unshackled, unescorted, except for one distant watchtower keeping an eye on the area. The path overlooked the forest beyond the wire. The winter sun, pale and weak, filtered through the branches. For a moment, just a moment, they felt like ordinary women walking outdoors on a cold day. Alice Morton whispered, "It's peaceful," and no one corrected her. After supper, potato stew and a slice of coarse bread, the women gathered near the warm stove. The barracks had become unexpectedly comfortable. The stove crackled softly. Someone began to sing under her breath, a tune from home. Another joined her. Soon the entire room hummed with the quiet melody of an English hymn. Outside, a German guard passing by paused. He listened. Then he moved on silently, not interrupting. By the end of the second day, something irreversible had begun to take root. The British women no longer saw the guards as faceless enemies. They saw men who limped, men who were hungry, men who had sisters and wives and daughters somewhere in the ruins of the Reich. Men who did not want cruelty to define their remaining days. The phrase, paradise on earth, would not be spoken yet. But the feeling that life inside Stalag 5B was not the nightmare they feared. That it might, in ways impossible to admit, be the safest place they had stood in months, began to seep into their bones. 2 nights later, the fear they had carried since capture cracked. A strange moment revealed everything. A British woman awoke screaming, trapped in a nightmare from the artillery bombardments that preceded her capture. Before anyone could calm her, the barracks door flew open and 2 German guards rushed inside. But instead of shouting, instead of punishing the noise, they came forward with gentle urgency. Alles gut, one said, raising his hands. You are safe. No bombs here. The guard knelt beside her. Actually knelt. His face filled with concern, not anger. The room fell silent except for the trembling breaths of the woman being comforted. No one forgot that moment. It changed something in the air. Something fragile. Something that felt like a truce not written on paper, but in simple human gestures. The next morning, mail arrived. A miracle. The German guards distributed letters from the Red Cross, calling out names carefully, respectfully. When Alice Morton received a letter from her fiancé, her hands shook so violently she nearly tore it open. The guard handing it to her whispered, "Good news?" Tears streamed down her cheeks. "He's alive." The guard bowed his head slightly, as though sharing the relief. That night, sitting around the stove, Evelyn finally said what several had been thinking, but none dared to voice aloud. "This isn't what I expected. This isn't what any of us expected." Margaret nodded slowly. "It feels wrong to say it, but they're treating us better than half the places we passed through on our own side." Silence followed. Not disagreement, just the weight of truth. The transformation had begun, and soon the British women would witness moments that would push the boundaries even further. Moments of kindness so profound, so unthinkable in wartime, that they would one day look back on this place, this German camp, this unlikely sanctuary, and call it something no captured soldier should ever call enemy ground. Paradise on earth. The third week inside Stalag VB settled into a rhythm so stable, so strangely humane, that the British women often caught themselves forgetting the barbed wire outside their barracks windows. Not forgetting the war, no one could forget that, but forgetting the instinctive flinch that had lived in their muscles since their capture. The guards no longer walked around them with stiff suspicion. Instead, they greeted the women each morning with small nods, sometimes even shy, awkward smiles, gestures that felt more like interactions between neighbours than enemies. Evelyn began most mornings in the infirmary, rolling fresh bandages, cleaning metal trays, and translating between the German medics and the other British women assigned there. Franz, the spectacled medic, had grown comfortable enough to ask her small questions. What English breakfast tasted like, whether London was really foggy, whether she missed home. He asked these questions not as a soldier gathering intelligence, but as a young man trying to understand a stranger whose life, under different circumstances, might have intersected his at a cafe or a library instead of a war-torn camp. One morning, as Evelyn sorted gauze beside him, a muffled boom rolled across the horizon, a distant artillery strike from the collapsing front. Franz froze, his hands trembling for an instant before he steadied himself. "You're afraid," Evelyn said gently. His jaw tightened. "Every day," he whispered. "But I am not allowed to show it." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Fear was the only universal language left in Europe. Yet the human admission, spoken so vulnerably by a German medic, shifted something deeper in her understanding. They were all trapped in the same crumbling continent, some behind wire, some outside it, but all waiting for war to devour or spare them. Later that day, a moment unfolded that none of the British women would ever forget. A Red Cross delivery arrived, small, pitifully small compared to earlier years of the war, but full of things so precious the women stared as though looking at treasure. Soap, condensed milk, biscuits, vitamin tablets, and even a few squares of chocolate. The German commandant himself supervised the distribution, ensuring fairness. When it was the British women's turn, he gestured to the parcels and said softly, "Your country sent these. Please take." Most of the women reached for the familiar brown-wrapped parcels with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the sight of English writing after so many months living among foreign words. Alice Morton pressed her parcel to her chest like a child clutching a gift. Helen Parker held her chocolate square for a full minute before eating it, closing her eyes as though tasting home. But then, something unexpected happened. A group of German guards, thin, hollow-cheeked, surviving on rations barely enough for soldiers, watched from the side. They were not resentful. They were not jealous. If anything, they looked relieved for the women, but their eyes betrayed their own hunger. And then, Evelyn did something that defied every rule of war, every unspoken line between captor and captive. She walked over to one of the guards, an older man named Weber, who always ensured her infirmary group received extra coal, and she broke her biscuit in half. "For you," she said simply. He stared at the biscuit, a piece of English food, a symbol of comfort from the other side of the wire. "I cannot," he whispered. "Against regulations." Evelyn shrugged. "Then I am breaking the rules. What will you do? Arrest me?" A smile, small and tired, cracked across his weathered face. He accepted the biscuit and bowed his head in gratitude. That tiny act, one woman sharing food across the war's most sacred barrier, spread through the compound like rumour, like wildfire, like proof that the boundaries dictating who mattered and who didn't had already begun to dissolve. The next morning, the guards repaid the gesture. When the women lined up for breakfast, each found an extra chunk of dark bread placed carefully at the edge of her bowl. No guards mentioned it. No one discussed the exchange openly. But the meaning was clear. In this camp, kindness had become a secret currency, traded quietly beneath the weight of uniforms. Later that week, the British women were invited, not ordered, to attend a small musical evening organised by the German soldiers. It was held in the long recreation hut, its wooden walls decorated with branches, makeshift lanterns, and scraps of paper shaped into stars. The event was meant, the commandant explained, to give our camp a little humanity before the war swallows what is left of it. The British women sat together near the front. German soldiers filled benches behind them. The atmosphere was polite, almost reverent. A young German with a violin performed a slow, haunting piece that drifted through the cold air like smoke. Then a female auxiliary sang an old folk lullaby. Her voice cracked halfway through, and the room fell into a heavy silence. Without thinking, Margaret Fielding reached forward and squeezed the auxiliary's hand. The girl, barely 19, burst into tears. She whispered, "My brother died last week, on the Eastern Front. I only found out yesterday." Margaret, who had brothers of her own fighting in France, did the only humane thing she could. She pulled the young German woman into an embrace. No one in the room thought it improper. No one looked away in contempt. War had broken every rule except the last one: compassion for another grieving human being. After the music ended, something extraordinary occurred. A German officer asked, with stiff politeness, whether the British women might sing something from home. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then Helen Parker stood and began to sing the first verse of "Abide with Me." Her voice was steady. The second verse was joined by Margaret. By the third, almost all the British women were singing, their voices rising like a fragile beam of warmth in a world growing darker each hour. The Germans listened in complete silence. When the final note faded, the commandant removed his cap. So did every German soldier in the room. No one spoke. No one dared to shatter the moment. When they returned to their barracks that night, Evelyn whispered what many had already been thinking yet feared to confess. It feels like we've found humanity in the last place we expected. Alice Morton nodded. It feels like the war stopped at the gate. But the war had not stopped outside. In fact, it was approaching faster than any of them realized. A week later, the distant thunder of artillery grew closer. The sky glowed orange some nights from bombardments over the next ridge. German newspapers, sometimes smuggled into the British barracks by sympathetic guards, spoke of collapsing fronts, encircled units, and cities lost. Yet inside the camp, life continued with that strange, surreal gentleness that felt like living inside a bubble made of fragile glass. One evening, as the women settled around the stove, the commandant entered their barracks unannounced. His face was pale. His cap was tucked under his arm. "Ladies," he began, "the front is near. The Americans may arrive soon. You must stay in your barracks when they approach. I will place a white sheet above the main gate. I give you my word, no German soldier here will endanger you." The women stared at him. Some even felt a pang of worry for the German guards who had treated them with such unexpected decency. War was cruelest to men already defeated. 2 days later, the distant rumble grew into the unmistakable sound of tank tracks. The sky vibrated with engines. German guards rushed to their posts, not to resist, but to surrender. As the first American armoured vehicles appeared at the tree line, the commandant strode to the gate holding a white bedsheet tied to a broom handle. His officers followed, unarmed. The British women watched from their barracks windows as the Americans shouted commands, weapons raised, until they recognized the women's uniforms, the friendly faces, the lack of panic. Then came the moment the women would talk about for the rest of their lives. As the Americans pushed through the gate, several British women stepped outside, just a few steps, hesitant, emotional, while the German guards stood still, hands raised high. One American lieutenant saw the British uniforms, froze and shouted, "Holy hell, what have they done to you?" Evelyn stepped forward. "Nothing," she said. Her voice wavered. "Nothing." "They treated us well." The American blinked in astonishment. "You're saying the Germans treated you well?" She nodded. "Better than we ever imagined." Behind her, the German guards stood silently, waiting for arrest. The British women looked at them, not as enemies, but as men who had protected them in the final, collapsing chapters of the war. Alice Morton stepped toward the nearest guard, Weber, the one who had once accepted half a biscuit, and whispered, "Thank you." He bowed his head. It was our duty. In the following days, as the camp was processed, the British women told the Americans everything, how the guards had protected them, fed them, treated them with dignity, how the commandant upheld the Geneva Convention with obsessive discipline, how they had found unexpected safety inside an enemy enclosure as the world outside dissolved into violence. Report after report astonished the Allied officers. One American colonel finally muttered, "I've never heard anything like it. A German camp called Paradise by the prisoners?" The British women didn't hesitate. "Yes," they said, "Paradise on earth." Not because it was luxurious, not because it was rich, but because in the middle of a world collapsing into cruelty, this one unlikely place had preserved something fragile and rare: honor, restraint, kindness, humanity. And long after the war ended, long after the women returned home, long after Europe rebuilt itself from rubble, they carried that memory with them, an impossible truth in a war of horrors. That sometimes, inside the unlikeliest corner of the enemy's land, humanity survived, and they had lived inside it. That was what made them call Stalag VB, quietly, gratefully, and without irony, Paradise on Earth.